She was on her knees, bruised and breathless, her body trembling as she whispered the faintest plea to stop the kick about to crash down on her. The drunk enforcer froze, not because of her words, but because the mafia boss across the room had recognized that face. 4 years ago, she had saved his mother's life and vanished without a trace. Now he had found her again, and he wasn't going to let her disappear this time. The glass fell first, shattering against the black marble floor like a burst of light. Champagne spilled, mingling with the glittering shards. Then came her knees, striking the stone so hard her vision blurred. Music still floated through the air, a lazy jazz tune fading beneath the coarse laughter of men in tailored suits, men who had never been told no. But down the dim corridor leading to the VIP room, thick with cigar smoke and expensive cologne, Emily Carter was being dragged by a drunk man with bloodshot eyes and a fist tangled in her hair, yanking her like a broken puppet. His voice, thick with alcohol and rage, tore through the noise. "You think we're stupid, think we don't know you've been listening." Emily choked on a sob, her chest tightening until no words came out. I'm just a waitress. I was only bringing champagne to the back room. I didn't hear anything." The man she couldn't recall if his name was Sean or Steve jerked her head back, exposing her throat. Violence glinted in his eyes. She felt the sting of glass buried in her palms, blood seeping through her skin, the heat of pain crawling up her arm. Everyone in the club was too busy laughing, drinking, throwing money over polished poker tables. No one looked toward the corridor. No one saw her. The manager had warned her once, never look a guest in the eye, never ask questions, and above all, never remember anything. She had followed every rule. 3 months of silent work, just enough to feed her younger brother, just enough to survive. But one wrong step, one unlucky glance, and she was on the floor of the very place she thought was safe. Sean stepped back, readying the kick. His expensive shoes gleamed under the lights, glossy and merciless. "You know what they say about rats, right? They get exterminated." He smirked, raising his foot. Emily knew that if it landed, her ribs would snap. A week ago, she had been mugged after her night shift at the diner, thrown against a brick wall, her bag ripped away. Since then, she had wrapped her own ribs in bandages, avoiding hospitals she couldn't afford. She breathed shallowly, bracing herself, her eyes lifted to his, wet but unyielding. Then she whispered, "Please don't kick me. I'm already hurt. No defense, no excuse. Just a truth stripped bare, fragile but painfully honest." And in that moment, the hallway seemed to drop 10 degrees colder. Sean froze, not from pity but from the sound behind him. Calm, measured, and deadly. Sean. Emily didn't dare turn, but she saw his leg lower slowly, his body going rigid. Footsteps echoed slow, deliberate. No rush, no need. A shadow loomed above her. The music from the lounge went on, but her world stopped. Nathan Moretti stood there tall, composed, face unreadable, eyes cold as steel. His voice was steady. "Precise. Lethal. I saw what you were doing." The question is, why Emily couldn't lift her gaze from the floor. Instinct screamed, "Don't look. Don't speak. Don't breathe." Yet curiosity foolish. Human won. She looked up, and met the eyes of the man they all feared. His dark gaze locked onto hers, as if searching through time itself. She felt it, he was looking for something. A memory. A name. A promise once made. Everything blurred. Then he reached out his hand. Strong. Ringed in gold, engraved with a family crest. Not a wedding band. "I won't say it twice," he murmured, his voice low but carrying. Emily's trembling hand rose to his. He lifted her gently, and she winced as pain shot through her ribs. His brow furrowed. "You're hurt." Not a question. A statement. "I'm fine." He said nothing more, only took her wrist, pressing 2 fingers to her pulse, checking, confirming. Then he turned to Sean, his eyes now a frozen abyss. "She has nothing to fear. She works here. She is under my protection. And no one, touches what's mine without my permission. Emily stood still, heart pounding in her aching chest, too dazed to comprehend. But she understood one thing with perfect clarity. Her life had just changed course. And Nathan Moretti, the most powerful man in Chicago's underworld, was never going to let her go back to her old one again. No one in the room dared to speak when Nathan Moretti ordered that Emily be taken into his private office. The dark wooden door closed behind them, sealing off the music and the murmurs from outside. Emily sat upright on the leather chair, her hands still trembling slightly even after they had been roughly bandaged. A glass of water sat before her on the desk. She didn't drink. She didn't know what to do. All she knew was that Nathan's gaze from across the table made it impossible to take a full breath. The mafia boss said nothing for nearly 3 minutes. He simply sat there, silent, as if rearranging fragments of memory one by one. Every blink seemed to carry the weight of years. At last, he leaned forward, his low, steady voice breaking the quiet not cold this time, but laced with something she couldn't name. "Do you remember me?" Emily swallowed hard, hesitant. I don't think we've met before." Nathan nodded slightly. No accusation, no surprise. He leaned back, eyes drifting toward the ceiling as though speaking to the past itself. 4 years ago, the Westfield Farmers Market. Early autumn. A Sunday morning. My mother collapsed from low blood pressure. No one helped her. People walked by. Some turned away. But one young woman wearing a gray apron, hair loosely tied, called for an ambulance. She held my mother's hand, cradled her head in her lap, spoke to her until help arrived, and then she disappeared. Left no name, no trace. Emily's fingers clenched together until her knuckles turned white. She hadn't meant to say anything, but a quiet voice inside her whispered that was his mother. I remember now. She was wearing a blue coat. She smelled of lavender. Her wrist trembled when I held it. I just thought she was someone's mother. Someone who was scared. I've had a mother too. And I knew what that fear felt like. Nathan closed his eyes for a moment. The circles beneath them were dark, but there was still light somewhere within. His face revealed nothing, yet she could feel something real stirring beneath the surface. "She told that story for years," he said softly. "She said there was only one person who didn't look at her as a burden, that you spoke to her like she was still awake." Emily's throat tightened. She hadn't known it mattered that much. "I only did what was right." Nathan gave a faint laugh, though it carried no warmth. It was weary. The kind that comes from seeing too much wrong to still believe in pure rightness. And you think doing the right thing in this city comes without consequence. It wasn't a question. It was a warning. Emily looked at him. For the first time, not out of fear, but because she recognized something familiar. A man still trying to preserve what little humanity he had left in a world ruled by power and transactions. Nathan rose from his chair, walked closer, and sat opposite her. The space between them was now just the length of an arm. "I searched for you for 3 years," he said. "Sent men to hospitals, diners, free clinics, checked security footage, payroll records, even student loan applications. No one could find you, and I thought I'd never see you again, until tonight." He paused, his gaze sharp and steady. Then he spoke slowly, like delivering a verdict. "I don't believe in fate, but I do believe in debts of gratitude." Emily felt her heart sink. Not from fear, not from defense, just an inexplicable weight, as though an invisible thread connecting the past and the present had gently tightened around her. She didn't know whether to be thankful, anxious, or afraid to stay. But in that moment, she understood one thing this man did not forget, and he did not forgive what the world had done to her. He wasn't a good man, but for her, he was choosing to be something else. The girl who once whispered in fear to save her own life had now become the reason a mafia boss stopped the machinery of power just to repay a debt the rest of the world had long forgotten. Before Emily could respond to Nathan's final words, the door of memory opened in her mind like an old film reel spinning in slow motion. A faint scent of lavender drifted by. Autumn sunlight spilled across colorful stalls, and the calls of vendors echoed through the familiar farmers market on the edge of Westfield. Chicago. 4 years earlier, Emily had been 23, working morning shifts at a small cafe and using her short break to buy vegetables for dinner with her younger brother. The market was unusually crowded that day. People jostled over baskets of melons, corn, flowers, and cured meats, each lost in their own world. She was picking out carrots when she heard a soft crash behind her, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting concrete. Turning around, she saw an elderly woman collapsed beside the honey stand. Some people stepped back. Others quietly lifted their phones to record. No one bent down. No one called for help. Emily ran. The woman wore a light blue coat, her silver hair disheveled, face pale, lips cracked. Emily knelt, lifting the woman's head gently into her lap, one hand supporting her neck to keep her airway open. She grabbed her phone, voice trembling but steady. "There's an elderly woman unconscious at the Westfield market. She's not responding. Her breathing's shallow. Please come quickly." Then she leaned close, whispering near the woman's ear. "Ma'am, can you hear me? What's your name? Do you have diabetes? Your hands are cold. Please, don't close your eyes. I'm right here." The woman didn't answer, only gave a faint moan, her eyelids fluttering. Emily held her hand tight, scanning the crowd for help, but no one stopped. A man with a bag of apples shook his head and walked past. She didn't care. The woman reminded her too much of her mother, the same wrinkled skin, the same exhausted eyes that had once flickered out after a long day of work. Her mother had fainted once in their kitchen from exhaustion. And that time, there was no one there but Emily. No one. The ambulance arrived in 8 minutes. But for Emily, it felt like forever. The paramedics pulled her aside, fitted the woman with oxygen, checked her pulse, attached monitors. One of them asked Emily for her name. She shook her head. "I'm not family. I just happened to be here." She stood, brushed the dust from her dress, watched as they lifted the woman onto a stretcher, then turned away. No need for thanks. No need for explanations. She only wanted to return to her heavy life, the unpaid bills, her brother's asthma medication, the endless routine that left no room for heroics. But that moment, the warmth of the woman's hand, the dim flicker in her clouded eyes before she slipped into unconsciousness, etched itself into Emily's memory. Though she never told anyone, and when Nathan recounted every detail, she finally understood why his gaze carried that strange weight. He hadn't just recognized her face. He remembered the act itself, an act no one else in the world had noticed. Back then, she had been just an anonymous girl in a noisy market. But to a mother teetering between life and death, she was everything. And to a son who had witnessed it, she became a sacred debt that no power or money could ever repay. Emily said nothing. She lowered her head, a strange emotion welling in her chest. Not pride, not fear, but the quiet astonishment of realizing that something she had done in silence had not vanished after all. It had stayed, alive, in the memory of someone she never expected. And now, it had led her back to a place she thought she didn't belong, or perhaps the only place left that still saw her true worth. Emily didn't know how long she had been sitting in that room after Nathan left. He hadn't said another word after his final sentence, only left her with a single, steady look, as if to confirm that everything needing to be spoken had already been said. The door closed softly behind him, but what lingered inside her was anything but soft. The truth about that day at the market, the moment she helped a stranger, had now become a thread tying her to a world entirely different from her own. She couldn't understand how a single act of kindness had led her here, but she could feel it deep down. Everything was about to change. She sat there with her fingers intertwined, biting her lower lip to stay awake in the blur of shock. The light in the room had dimmed. Distant jazz still drifted faintly from the main floor. And then, something strange happened. The music stopped. Completely. Every sound in the building seemed to collapse into silence, as if someone had crushed the air itself with an invisible command. Emily looked up, a heart pounding. Nathan's voice came through the intercom system, calm, steady, and cold. There was no echo, no dramatization. yet every word carved itself into the stone walls. Tonight, a regrettable misunderstanding occurred in the private service area. I want everyone in this establishment, regardless of title, relation, or position, to listen carefully to what I am about to say. Each word landed like a heartbeat falling onto marble. Emily rose, her legs trembling as she made her way toward the staircase overlooking the main hall. From there, she saw everyone had already stood up from their tables, the men in suits, the women in glittering gowns. Familiar and unfamiliar faces alike, all turned toward the upper level, where Nathan Moretti had stepped onto the small balcony that overlooked the entire club. The lights dimmed further, leaving only a single beam of soft light on him. No one spoke. No one moved. Nathan stood there, needing no microphone. No I'd. He needed only his gaze and the silence that surrounded him. The young woman named Emily Carter, server at the Crimson Lounge, from this moment forward, is under my direct protection. Anyone intentionally or otherwise who harms her in any way, through word, action, or even a glance, will be choosing to stand against me. There will be no exceptions, no second chances. A wave of silence swept through the room like a tide, pulling everything down with it. Some exchanged brief glances, most quickly lowered their eyes. Emily could feel the tension ripple across the crowd, the tightening collars, the fading smirks, the sudden stillness. Nathan's gaze held them in place as he continued, voice unwavering. I don't need you to understand why. I only need you to remember the outcome. She is here because she did what no one else dared to do. And I will repay that debt not with money, but with the only thing I truly possess, my guarantee that from this night on, she will never have to bow her head again. The last sentence swept through Emily like a cold wind across her spine, not out of fear but because she had never heard anyone speak of her that way. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't a sentence. It was a declaration, firm, public, and absolute, that she was no longer invisible. The woman who had lived her life in the shadows had just been pulled into the light, not by glory, but by gratitude. She didn't know where to stand or how to react. But when Nathan turned and walked away, the lights slowly returned to normal, and the music rose again. She felt dozens of eyes on her, some curious, some envious, some suspicious, and others cautious. A simple waitress like her had suddenly become someone the entire club would have to acknowledge. And the most terrifying part wasn't that she was now protected. It was that she could no longer be ordinary. Across the glossy black floor, Emily walked slowly toward the bar. Marco, the loyal bodyguard who shadowed Nathan, was already waiting there, his expression unreadable but not unkind. He gave a brief nod. From now on, if you need anything, you come to me. Just one sentence. No more. But it was enough for Emily to understand her life no longer belonged to silence. She had been placed on a different kind of chessboard now, one where every move was being watched, every step calculated, and she didn't know yet whether she was just a pawn or the reason the game existed at all. Emily's apartment sat on the third floor of an old red brick building, its paint peeling and wooden stairs creaking with every step. It was the place she and Ben had called home for nearly 3 years, not much to look at, but enough to keep them warm through Chicago's brutal winters, enough to remind them they still had each other. But that night, when Emily opened the door after Nathan's thunderous declaration at the Crimson Lounge, even the air inside felt different. This was no longer a refuge, no longer a place where she could hide within her own invisibility. Everything had changed, even if the walls still wore their faded paint. The kitchen still smelled faintly of instant noodles, and Ben's old armchair still sat open with a half-read textbook draped over its arm. She sat down on the edge of her bed, slowly removing her shoes. Her gaze fell to her palms where the cuts from earlier still oozed faint traces of blood beneath the rough bandage. It didn't hurt anymore. What hurt was the quiet realization that she no longer had control over anything. She thought of all the eyes that had turned toward her when Nathan declared she was under his protection. Of Marco, the tall, unsmiling man who had followed her ever since, a shadow moving wherever she went. Of the sudden, polite nods, the cautious greetings from people who once looked through her as though she didn't exist. Everything had changed too quickly. Too much. Too unreal. Part of her was grateful. She wasn't foolish. Nor ingrateful. Nathan hadn't needed to do any of it. He was the most powerful man in a world where she was barely dust, and yet he had chosen to remember her, to stand for her, to make her untouchable. But another part of her felt something tightening around her. Slowly and invisibly. She was no longer allowed to simply be a waitress. Every movement she made was being watched, how she spoke to customers, what kind of coffee she ordered during her breaks. People whispered behind her back. Some of the women on staff had begun avoiding her, as though she'd signed a deal with the devil. And Emily, in turn, felt like a bird in a gilded cage. Beautiful, safe, but still a cage. That night, after Ben had fallen asleep, she stepped out onto the small balcony. The street below was slick with rain, glowing amber under the streetlights. Distant traffic hummed softly. The sound of wheels splashing through puddles. The cold wind bit through her thin coat. But she didn't move. She was searching for an answer to the question that had haunted her since she'd left the club. Was this a gift or a trap? If she accepted Nathan's protection, did that mean she was surrendering her freedom? Yet if she refused it, would that make her ungrateful, foolish, even for rejecting something most people could only dream of? She didn't know. And the terrifying part was, no one else could answer for her. Everything Nathan had done was right. There had been no demand, no threat, no coercion, only silence. But it was that very silence that unsettled her most. If he had asked for something, loyalty, a signature, obedience, it would have made sense. But he hadn't. He had given her protection as a debt repaid and left her to face the cost of it alone. To everyone else, she was fortunate, lifted up, respected, untouchably. But inside, she felt herself drifting further from the person she used to be. She missed the days before all this began, the evenings when she came home exhausted yet lighthearted, invisible and free, when no one cared who she was. Now, every step she took left a trace. Every glance reminded her she was no longer allowed to make mistakes. Emily sank to the floor, resting her head against the cold wall. No tears came. She wasn't weak, just tired. Bone-deep tired. She had once believed that protection was the safest thing a woman could have in this world. But for the first time in her life, she understood there are kinds of protection that make it hard to breathe. And she wasn't sure anymore whether she'd been rescued or captured forever. 3 days later, while Emily was still struggling to adjust to the strange new attention she drew at the Crimson Lounge, a sleek black car pulled up in front of her crumbling apartment building. Marco stepped out and handed her a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten card in elegant, careful script. My mother would like to invite you for lunch. There is no obligation. If you agree, the car will wait at exactly 11 a.m. tomorrow. No reply needed. Marco gave a curt nod and left, his footsteps fading down the dim hallway, leaving Emily standing motionless. The card clenched in her trembling hand like a fragment of fate. She didn't know what to expect. She had never set foot in the world of people like them, where houses were vast. Meals followed rules, and conversations carried meaning even in what was left unsaid. Still, the next morning, right at 11, she put on the most modest dress she owned, tied her hair neatly, and stepped into the car. The mansion stood in the northern outskirts of Chicago, hidden behind a row of crimson maples blazing with autumn. The iron gate opened soundlessly, revealing what looked like a painting brought to life, a place where time seemed to slow. When the car stopped at the stone steps, Rose Moretti was already waiting on the porch. She wore a cream-colored dress with a soft wool cardigan. Her silver hair was pinned up neatly, her eyes deep yet warm, carrying something gentler than authority. Emily stepped out, and before she could say a word, Rose took her hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. I never knew how to thank the person who saved my life, she said softly. But if you'll allow it, today we'll eat as two people, no titles, no debts. Something inside Emily eased. She nodded faintly and followed her inside. The house carried the refined charm of old Italian nobility, bright stone walls, tall windows, long tables, paintings that seemed to hang from the ceiling itself. But unlike the cold grandeur she had imagined, this place felt alive. It smelled of toasted bread and herbs. Gentle jazz played from an old radio, Sunlight spilled through linen curtains. They ate in the kitchen, not the formal dining room. The table was set for 2 chicken soup, garlic bread, a bowl of crisp green salad. No servants in sight. Rose poured the water herself, sliced the bread, and spoke in the easy rhythm of memory stories about her garden, about the first time she saw Nathan at a piano, about the days when her late husband was still alive. Emily listened, little by little letting her guard fall. It was the first time in weeks she had laughed, not out of politeness, not out of discomfort, but because something genuinely warmed her. She was surprised that Rose didn't ask about her life, or the incident at the club, or Nathan. Instead, she told stories about her own mother, a Polish refugee who had fled the war, and how she used to say that kindness never loses its worth, even when buried deep beneath the world's indifference. When lunch was nearly over, Rose stood and opened a small drawer near the kitchen counter. She took out a velvet box the color of red wine and placed it gently in front of Emily. Her eyes were steady, but tender. "This belonged to my grandmother," she said. "In our family, it is passed down to the woman we believe has a heart strong enough to endure the storm. I have no daughter, but now, I believe I've found one." Emily opened the box. Inside lay a delicate silver chain with a blue stone that shimmered like winter twilight. Her throat tightened, tears nearly came. Not because of the gift's beauty, but because of what it meant to be seen, acknowledged, trusted, as if she belonged to something larger than herself. She looked up, wanting to refuse, but Rose placed a calm hand over hers. "This isn't charity," she said. "It's an invitation. You may accept it or not. But if you do, you are no longer a guest in this house. No one here will demand anything from you, but no one here will abandon you either." Emily bit her lip, her eyes glistening. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like someone receiving mercy. She felt like someone being welcomed home. The meal ended with warm mint tea and birdsong drifting in through the window. When Emily left, Rose walked her all the way to the car, holding her hand once more. "You once saved my life," she said quietly. "I can't repay that. I only hope you know that there will always be a place to return to when the world becomes too much. Not a mansion, just a porch, a small table, and someone who truly waits for you." On the drive back, Emily held the velvet box tightly against her chest, as if it were the one thing keeping her from dissolving into the wind. She didn't know what the future would bring. But for the first time, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't completely alone. The following week passed in a strange rhythm Emily had never known before. The stares at the Crimson Lounge slowly softened into cautious nods. Marco kept a respectful distance but was always somewhere nearby, an unspoken shadow. Emily learned to adjust her posture, to answer customers in a tone balanced between grace and quiet resolve, neither submissive nor defiant. Rose's words still echoed in her mind. She could choose to remain apart, or step into that world as someone accepted within it. She hadn't decided which path to take. But for the first time in months, she no longer felt cornered. On a rare sunny afternoon, while folding napkins in the storage room, her phone rang. The call was from Ben's high school. The voice of the administrative secretary was calm, almost mechanical. Yet the words struck Emily so sharply she nearly dropped the phone. "We're calling to confirm that student Ben Carter has been awarded a partial scholarship for the STEM preparatory program beginning next term. We've sent an email and a letter to your home address. But since we haven't received a response, we wanted to follow up by phone." Emily froze. Her heart stumbled. She had spent years fighting to keep Ben from being crushed under the weight of their finances, scraping together rent, skipping meals, working double shifts so he could keep studying the programming and engineering he loved. Tuition had always been an impossible wall. She had never even applied for scholarships. Their paperwork was never enough. Her voice trembled. "I'm sorry, but where did this scholarship come from? Who nominated him?" There was a short pause on the line, then a hesitant tone. "I'm not entirely sure. Miss Carter. The scholarship is called the Moretti Initiative. It's funded by a private benefactor. We were asked not to disclose further details." A sharp ache bloomed in Emily's chest, like someone had just drawn a wire tight around her heart. She ended the call, her fingers shaking, unable to dial the next number right away. Then she called Marco. He picked up after 3 rings, his voice steady. "Are familiar?" "I know," he said simply. "I'll confirm." Less than an hour later, a message arrived. "Yes, it's him, but not to control, to balance." Emily sank to the kitchen floor, the same cold spot where she had once buried her face in her hands. Trying to figure out how to afford Ben's asthma medication. Memories flooded her, Ben hunched over his homework in dim yellow light. Stifling coughs so she wouldn't worry. The soft scraping of pencils and the sound of his hope persisting through exhaustion. She had carried everything for so long alone. Quietly. Without complaint. And now someone had carried a part of it for her. Without warning. Without asking anything in return. Just a silent signature attached to a name that could never go unnoticed. Moretti. Emily didn't know whether to be grateful or afraid, because even wrapped in kindness, a debt was still a debt, and she couldn't pretend she didn't understand that everything Nathan did had meaning even when he said nothing. That evening, when Ben came home from school, Emily was waiting at the table, the opened envelope beside her. Inside lay the letter, cream-colored paper embossed with gold. The seal raised and official. Ben skimmed it, his eyes widening like a child's before a Christmas tree. "Does this mean I really got in, that we can afford it, that I don't have to quit school?" Emily could only nod. She didn't have the strength to tell him that yes, it was true. But the price of it was something she still couldn't name. Ben threw his arms around her, holding tight enough to steal her breath. "I promise. I'll work hard. I won't waste it. I swear." She brushed his hair back, smiling faintly though her eyes burned. She had never seen him this happy. And maybe, just for that smile, she was willing to take on one more debt, not to the Mafia, but to her own heart, because in the end, once you've become someone's sister, choice is a luxury you no longer have. When Emily walked back into the Crimson Lounge for her evening shift the next night, the air had changed. It wasn't just curiosity or cautious glances anymore. It was looks laced with implication, and half-hidden smirks, and whispers spoken just loudly enough for her to hear, yet too vague to be held accountable. See, a pretty face in the right boss's favor doesn't need to carry trays to get her brother a scholarship. I'd say she's trading favors for a place at the table. That's sad. A soft look of hers, just his type. Isn't it? They never said her name. But Emily heard every word. She didn't react. She simply lowered her gaze, arranging glassware, wiping the counter, moving between the VIP tables as if nothing had changed. But inside, it felt as though something was tightening around her chest. Slowly, deliberately. There was an unspoken rule in places like this: the more attention you drew, the easier you became a target. And now Emily was the bullseye. She didn't need to catch every whisper to know she was being shut out. The co-workers who used to share her night shifts now avoided her eyes. Some refused to work her section. Worse, a few regular patrons began acting overly familiar, touches that lingered. Comments that crossed lines, treating her as though Nathan's protection had turned her into some kind of luxury toy stamped reserved for the boss. That night, Michelle, one of the veteran servers, the same woman who once taught Emily how to fold napkins the Italian way, pulled her into the break room mid-shift. Michelle wasn't one for small talk, but her eyes tonight held a quiet warning. "You're becoming the center of attention," she said softly, "and not in the way anyone wants to be. They don't hate you because you're protected. They hate you because you didn't have to fight to stand where they've been bleeding to stay. Whether it's true or not, they won't care." Emily sat still, her back pressed against the locker, staring at her scuffed heels. "What should I do?" Then she asked quietly. Michelle sighed, turning a cigarette between her fingers without lighting it. "You've got to choose. Either disappear before the storm hits, or stand up and face it. Shut them down one by one, not with his name. With yours." The words fell into the heavy silence of Emily's mind like stones sinking through deep water. She understood. She couldn't keep living under the shadow of a debt, no matter how kindly it had been given, no matter how gentle Rose was, or how calm, deliberate, and private Nathan seemed in the eyes of the world. She was still the woman who had been chosen, and favor was never free. After closing that night, Emily stood alone in the locker room, She unclipped her hair, letting the long brown strands fall loose and messy around her shoulders. She looked into the mirror, no makeup, no glamour lights, just her. The woman who had once knelt on a cold hallway floor. The woman who had cried quietly and kept going. The woman who once helped a stranger without expecting anything in return. Now she was the woman learning to breathe in a world that punished sincerity. Emily took a long, steady breath, tightened the strings of her apron, and walked out. The music resumed. The glasses clinked, and the murmurs carried on, but she didn't bow her head this time. She lifted it, meeting each gaze that followed her, not with defiance, not with pride, but with the calm steadiness of someone who knew she was being judged, yet refused to vanish. Because if she allowed others to define her worth, then the greatest debt she would ever owe wasn't to Nathan Moretti. It would be to her own silence. 3 days later, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, Emily decided to leave the city for a few hours, just long enough to escape the suffocating air of the Crimson Lounge and the web of rumors clinging to her like invisible threads. She took a bus to a small town south of Chicago, to a family diner she and Ben had visited a few times years ago. It was an ordinary place, one that didn't know her name. No stares, no whispers, no weight of power pressing down on her shoulders. The diner was old-fashioned, wooden tables worn smooth by years of use, walls lined with photos of country singers from the 80s. Emily chose a seat by the window, ordered a sandwich and an iced tea, and felt the tension in her chest ease a little with each sound of clinking silverware, each burst of laughter from the regulars, each soft note from the radio humming somewhere behind the counter. For a moment, it felt safe. But then, she felt it, a gaze. Not casual curiosity, not polite attention, but something sharper, watchful, measuring. She kept her face calm, took a slow breath, and turned her head just enough to see. At the back of the diner, 2 men sat at the last table near the wall. They were dressed plainly, but their posture was too straight, their stillness too deliberate for such a lazy afternoon. One pretended to look at his phone. Though the screen was black, the other stirred his coffee without touching it. Emily turned back to her plate, her throat tight. They weren't locals, but they didn't look like Nathan's people either. She didn't know whether this was a threat or coincidence, but every instinct in her screamed that something was wrong. Her hand slipped into her bag, brushing the strap as she prepared to leave. Then a waiter appeared beside her and placed a folded note on the table. "Someone asked me to give you this," he said before walking away. Emily opened it. 3 short lines in black ink, written with a steady, deliberate hand. "You're in the wrong place. Leave him while you still can. This won't be our last warning." Her hand crumpled the paper until it was almost torn, her palms cold and slick. She knew she was being watched. She knew this wasn't an accident. And most of all, she knew exactly who him meant. She didn't panic, didn't run, didn't make a scene. She simply placed money on the table, picked up her coat, and walked out as if nothing had happened. But when the door closed behind her, she didn't head toward the bus stop. Instead, she circled around the building to the narrow alley behind the diner. The late afternoon light was thin and gray, the air heavy with the scent of asphalt. She pulled out her phone and dialed Marco. He answered almost immediately. "I'm being followed," she said plainly, no tremor, no pretense of bravery. "Little Pines Diner. Joliet. 2 men. They left a note." Marco's tone changed instantly, sharp and contained. "Did they touch you?" "No. Just watched." "There's a note, yes." He paused for a heartbeat. When he spoke again, his voice was firm, clipped. "Stay put. Don't move. My team will be there in 15 minutes. Do not leave that spot." Emily sank down onto the cold concrete step behind the diner, her thoughts tangled beyond sense. She didn't fully understand what she had stepped into, but now she knew. Nathan's protection hadn't only drawn whispers, it had drawn attention from people willing to get their hands dirty. Her mind echoed the question that had haunted her for weeks only now. It wasn't a whisper of doubt, but a clear pulse of fear. Was this a gift, or the beginning of a war she could never win? When the black SUV pulled into the alley, Marco stepped out first. His eyes swept the area with the cold precision of someone trained to find threats. There was no one left. Only the crumpled paper still in Emily's hand. He took it. Read it quickly. Then looked at her. His voice was rough. Quiet. But every word carried weight. "This isn't their last warning," he said. "And they're not the only ones watching you. They know you're Nathan's only weakness." Emily said nothing. She didn't have to. She already knew. And from that moment on, she understood that her steps were no longer her own. She was walking between two worlds now, one of power and one of danger. And both were waiting for her to fall. Returning to Chicago after what had happened in Joliet, Emily thought she had grown accustomed to being watched, to living in a constant state of alertness, always aware of Marco or someone from Nathan's team hovering nearby like a shadow. But what happened on that Thursday night taught her that no amount of preparation could ever be enough once danger decided to take shape in flesh and blood. That night, she left the Crimson Lounge later than usual. A thin rain fell, the drops glinting like shards of glass on the cobblestone street, and the neighborhood had fallen into a hush, as if the entire city were sleeping beneath a cold, wet blanket. Marco had been called away on an urgent matter, unable to escort her as he always did. Emily reassured him she could manage on her own, that it was only a few blocks, and she knew every corner by heart. What she didn't know was that someone had been waiting precisely for that moment. She turned into the narrow alley behind an old tavern, a shortcut to the bus stop. A soft echo of footsteps sounded behind her, sharp enough to make her turn. But no one was there. Only the dripping rain and a flickering streetlight. Then, from the other end of the alley, two figures emerged, tall and deliberate, their movements too certain, too purposeful. Emily froze. The Petrov brothers. She recognized them from Marco's warnings, enforcers of an Eastern European mafia faction that had once clashed violently with the Moretti family. Now they were standing less than 10 paces away. The older one, a long scar running down his neck, spoke first, his voice dragging over each word like a blade. "Who do you think you are?" Being protected by him like some kind of queen, a nameless waitress suddenly turned untouchable. "You think the world's that fair?" The younger brother said nothing, but in his hand gleamed a short iron rod, slick under the jaundiced light. Emily stepped back, her pulse hammering so hard she could hear it thundering through the rain. "I don't know who you are," she said, her voice trembling but steady enough to sound calm. "I have nothing to do with whatever this is. I'm just an ordinary person." The man with the scar gave a low laugh. "But you made him lose his balance. And that, sweetheart, is the one sin you can't afford." She didn't wait another second. She turned to run. But she had taken only 3 steps before a hand like iron clamped around her arm, yerking her backward. She fell hard onto the wet pavement, her head striking the wall, her vision dimming. The iron rod came down, but it never hit. The sound that followed was like an explosion in the rain. A figure came out of nowhere, slamming both men aside as though they were nothing but straw dummies. Through the haze and the downpour, Emily saw only fragments: a long black leather coat, a tattoo of a dragon curling down a strong forearm, and eyes she knew too well. Nathan. No guards, no entourage, just him, emerging from the storm, like something forged of silence and fury. He didn't speak. He only moved forward, his gaze fixed on the Petrovs with a cold, lethal clarity. The first punch sent the scarred one face first into a puddle. The second man tried to retaliate but was seized by the throat and thrown hard against the wall. The police arrived soon after. Alerted by the emergency signal from the safety bracelet Emily hadn't even known she was wearing. When it was over, when the attackers were handcuffed, and Nathan's men surrounded the alley like an unbreakable wall, Emily was still sitting there, her back against the wet brick, trembling from something deeper than fear. Nathan stepped closer, kneeling in front of her. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly. His voice was low, almost gentle, yet it carried through the night like a drumbeat against her chest. Emily nodded, but tears had already begun to fall, not from pain, but from the fragile realization that she might not have existed anymore. All because of a debt born 4 years ago. He offered his hand and helped her to her feet. His palm was large and warm, but it was no longer merely the hand of a mafia boss. It was the hand of a man standing at the thin line between blood and loyalty, choosing to cross it for the sake of someone the world deemed invisible. She didn't know how many steps she had already taken toward the darkness. But tonight, she knew one thing for certain. If she wanted to survive in this world, she couldn't depend solely on protection. She had to learn to stand, even while shaking. And perhaps it was time she learned the truth why it had all begun, and whether the price of survival was truly just the debt of the past. The rain from that night lasted until morning, as if the sky itself hadn't yet recovered from the violence that had erupted in the heart of the city. When Emily awoke the next day in the Moretti mansion's elegant guest room, her head felt heavy, as though her mind were still trapped in the moment when an iron rod had cut through the air and Nathan had appeared like a storm. Her clothes had been changed, the small cut on her forehead neatly bandaged, and a cup of warm tea sat waiting beside the bed. Everything had been arranged with such care that it almost denied the night before, but that very calmness unsettled her. She rose, walked out into the long corridor, and followed it toward the library. Nathan was standing with his back to her, facing a tall window that overlooked the rain-soaked garden. He wasn't wearing his usual suit, only a white shirt and dark trousers, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders bent slightly as though carrying an invisible weight. When he turned, his eyes no longer held the icy distance she had come to expect. They were shadowed, burdened somewhere between anger, worry, and perhaps regret. "Emily," he said, his voice lower than usual, "I owe you an apology for letting last night happen." She stood still, her hands clenched not from fear but to steady herself. "I told you," she said quietly. "I don't belong in this world. I don't want to be the reason for another war between your enemies. I'm just an ordinary person." "Nathan." He stepped closer, stopping only a few feet away. There was no longer a gulf between a mafia boss and a waitress, only two people standing in the truth neither could avoid. "You're not the cause," he said. "You're the reason they came for me, because you're the one weakness I've never learned to hide." Emily lifted her gaze, eyes shimmering. "Then I was right. I'm not being protected. I'm being used to draw you into danger. And my brother, that scholarship, it was just another way to make sure I stayed." Nathan's hand tightened. Then he shook his head slowly. "No, I didn't make you stay. If I had wanted that, you'd never have walked out of the club the first night we met. I let you choose because I thought you were strong enough to do what was right. But now that the Petrovs have touched you, every boundary is gone." He turned away, poured a small glass of liquor but didn't drink it. His voice carried the weight of something long buried rising to the surface. "I spared them once years ago because I believed blood should end with my father's generation. But they mistook mercy for weakness. They forgot that compassion doesn't mean I lost my teeth." Emily's breath caught. Nathan turned back to her, his eyes sharp as a blade. "I won't let anyone touch you again. Not because of an old debt, but because I can't bear the thought of losing you even if it means this city burns for it." The air thickened between them. Emily couldn't find words. She only felt something inside her chest crack, not from fear, but from understanding. The man standing before her wasn't merely protecting a girl who once saved his mother's life. He was fighting to protect the last thing that made him believe he could still save something at all. Nathan stepped closer and set the untouched glass on the table beside her. "You have the right to leave," he said quietly. "Right now. But if you stay, understand this. This is no longer about a favor. It's a front line, and you're on it. Not behind me. Not beside me. With me." Emily looked at him for a long time. She didn't nod. She didn't move. But her hands slowly unclenched. And in her heart, a new fear began to form, not of being pulled into his world, but of already being too deep to ever walk away without leaving part of her heart behind. Emily left the Moretti house that very night, taking nothing with her but a small handbag and the phone in her hand. She didn't tell anyone. Didn't leave a note. Marco offered to drive her, but she refused. She didn't want another shadow following her, not tonight. She needed to be alone. The air was still damp after the rain, the chill seeping through her layers of clothing. Yet she felt none of it. She simply walked, as if some current deep within her was pushing, pulling, urging her farther and farther away from everything. Away from Nathan's eyes. Away from the words, "You're the one weakness I've never learned to hide." Away from the world she had never chosen to enter but was being swallowed by a little more each day. With no escape in sight. She reached her old apartment close to midnight. Ben was asleep. The lamp in his room still on. Emily stood at the doorway for a moment, watching her younger brother's face, still boyish, despite the narrow shoulders that had carried too many years of poverty and illness. She went into the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water, her hands trembling. Everything seemed to break open all at once. All that she had been holding inside: fear, pressure, the weight of judgmental stares, the whispers behind her back. The memory of that iron rod slicing through the dark alley rushed out like a flood. She set the glass down and sank to the cold floor, burying her face in her hands as the sobs broke free. She didn't even know what she was crying for anymore. Fear, anger, or the helplessness of realizing her own life was no longer her own. She had once believed she was strong enough to endure anything, as long as Ben was safe. But now, even with her brother's scholarship secured and their small apartment warm, peace no longer lived within her. Her quiet sobs weren't loud, yet in the stillness of the night they echoed like the sound of a heart cracking open. She didn't know how long she sat there until she finally lifted her head and saw her phone still lit on the counter. A message from Nathan had arrived close to 1 a.m. It wasn't long, just 4 words. "Are you home safe?" Emily stared at the message, her lips trembling. Part of her wanted to ignore it. Another part wanted to pour out everything that was suffocating her. She picked up the phone and called. The line connected almost instantly. "Nathan," she whispered. He was silent for a moment before answering, his voice low and heavy, as if he too were holding something inside. "I'm here." She didn't try to steady her voice this time. She let it shake. Let the pain spill through every word. "I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I don't know if this is the right path or the wrong one. I don't know if I'm doing this for you, for Ben, or because I'm afraid everything will collapse if I stop." There was another stretch of silence. Then Nathan spoke, his tone no longer sharp and commanding, but soft, like someone trying to guide a lost child back home. "You don't have to keep proving anything, Emily. You don't have to be strong with me. If you want to leave, I'll open the door. If you need space, I'll step back. But if you fall, don't try to do it in silence. I'm here." Emily bit her lip as tears rolled down her cheeks. But this time they didn't choke her. Maybe. For the first time, she allowed herself not to be the one holding everything together. Not the one who was always right. Always calm. Always enduring. She said nothing. Only kept the phone to her ear, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing on the other end, like a tether keeping her from slipping over the edge. And in that quiet, she finally understood something she had long been afraid to admit. Nathan's presence in her life was no longer an intrusion. It had become part of what she feared losing most, and the only thing, at that moment, that made her feel she wasn't collapsing entirely alone in the dark. The next morning, just as Emily was stirring from an exhausted sleep, a rough knock jolted her awake. It wasn't polite, nor hurried. It was heavy, deliberate, and left no room for refusal. She ran a hand through her tangled hair, stepped out of her room, and peered through the peephole. Marco. He stood tall, his black coat draped over a broad frame, his face expressionless as ever. But there was something different in his eyes, something that didn't quite fit the cold mask he always wore. Emily opened the door. But before she could speak, Marco stepped inside, closing it behind him and leaning against the wall like a sentry rather than a guest. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice rough, scraped raw like fire passing through gravel. "Not under Mr. Finus. Moretti's orders. This is personal, from someone who's seen more than you think." Emily nodded slightly and gestured for him to sit, but Marco remained standing, his hands clasped before him. He studied her for a long time before continuing. "You think this is just a story about a powerful man touched by an old memory, opening his heart because of it. You think you're being protected out of gratitude for saving someone. But it's not that simple anymore." Emily's fingers tightened around the glass of water in front of her. She waited in silence. Marco stepped closer, his voice dropping lower. "You're at the center of a power shift. Your name's being mentioned in meetings between rival factions. You're not just the woman he cares about. You're a symbol, the only thing that can make him soften. And they'll use that." Emily drew in a breath. She had known it. Had felt it. But hearing the words spoken aloud so clear, so cold, made her chest tighten painfully. "Then what am I supposed to do?" she asked softly. "Run, hide, pretend I know nothing, and let others fight because of me?" Marco's gaze softened for the first time. "No. You're not that kind of person. But don't be foolish enough to think you can carry it alone. You're not a shield. Emily. You're human. People like Nathan and me, we've lived too long in blood. You haven't. And if you keep moving forward without knowing your own heart, there will come a day when you destroy everything, simply because you won't know what you're fighting for." Emily turned toward the window. The sky was still gray, the sunlight weak and hesitant. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to keep going," she whispered. "Every day I feel myself slipping away. I used to just take care of Ben. Go to work. Come home. Sleep. And repeat. Now it feels like I'm living someone else's life." Marco exhaled, stepping back toward the door. "We don't need you to become someone else. Nathan doesn't want that either. But he can't protect you forever if you don't know what you want. Power draws hatred. And hatred uses every weapon it can. If you truly mean to stay, then prepare not just in your mind, but in your will to live, to choose, and to bear the consequences." When Marco left, the apartment fell into a heavy stillness, and Emily felt as though the entire world had placed questions on her shoulders that no one else could answer. She went to the bathroom, washed her face, and stared at her reflection for a long time. Her skin was pale. Dark circles framed her eyes, and the faint scrapes on her wrists hadn't yet healed, but her eyes were different. Something within them had changed, deeper than exhaustion. It was the quiet fire that no longer belonged to the girl who used to bow her head and endure. It was what made her lift her chin, even through fear. When the door closed behind Marco, the silence of the room no longer felt empty. Inside her, a whisper rose, clearer than anything he had said. "If I want to live in their world, I can't stand in someone else's shadow. I must have my own reason, my own choice, and the courage to face what follows." She sat on the edge of her bed, picked up her phone, and scrolled to the name Nathan, not to ask for help, but to begin a different kind of conversation. This time, not as a lost girl, but as a woman learning to stand in the heart of the storm. 3 days later, Emily received an invitation from Rose for dinner at the Moretti estate. It was not extravagant or formal like the first time, just a small handwritten note delivered by Marco, accompanied by his quiet but weighted remark, "She doesn't invite people to dinner often, especially not twice." Emily hesitated, not out of fear, but because she wasn't sure she was ready to return to that place, the old mansion layered with too many unspoken emotions. Yet she agreed, sensing that some conversations must happen, even if one isn't sure they are ready to hear them. That evening, she wore a simple olive green dress, neat but modest, and tied her hair up high as usual, as though trying to contain the quiet turbulence gathering in her chest. When the black car stopped before the iron gates, dusk had just begun to settle, and the golden light spilling from the windows gave the house an almost tender warmth. Rose greeted her at the door, as graceful as ever, her kind eyes tempered by the sharp perception of a woman who had lived too long among complicated things. "I'm glad you came," she said, gently placing a hand on Emily's back, like a mother guiding her daughter through the doorway. "I'm making chicken stew, an old recipe from my mother-in-law. The smell might be a bit strong, but once you eat it, it settles the heart." Dinner took place in the small dining room behind the library, unadorned, without servants, just 2 women, 2 bowls of soup, a few slices of toasted bread, and a bottle of homemade olive oil between them. Their conversation unfolded slowly about the weather, about the old kitchen Rose refused to have remodeled, about the wildflowers beginning to bloom in the garden out back. Emily said nothing of Marco or of what had happened, but Rose's eyes watched her closely, not prying, simply waiting for Emily to open up, not with words, but through the way she looked down at her soup, the stillness of her hand when the spoon brushed the rim of the bowl. When the meal was nearly over, Rose rose to pour more tea from a porcelain pot on the shelf. She didn't return to her seat. Instead, she walked to a low wooden cabinet in the corner, opened the third drawer from the bottom, and took out a small box wrapped in deep red velvet. Returning to the table, she set it in front of Emily and said nothing for a few moments. Then she sat down, her eyes suddenly deep and far away. "This belonged to my mother," she said softly. "She wore it all her life, even when she fled Poland during the war. Even when she lived in a tiny apartment in New York where the floorboards groaned every winter. It was the one thing she never took off until the day she handed it to me, the day I decided to marry a man she believed would break me. She wasn't wrong. But she also said that whoever wears this must have the courage to keep her heart intact, even when the world demands she let it go." Emily opened the box. Inside lay a slender, time-worn silver chain with a small turquoise stone pendant, its surface faded by the years but still glinting faintly, like a buried memory catching the light. She looked up at Rose, her lips parting in protest. But before she could speak, Rose's hand gently covered hers. "You're not an outsider, Emily. You think you're just the woman who once helped me. But I've been watching you longer than you know, from the way you walk into a room with your chin held high, to the way you hide your wounds so no one has to worry. You remind me of my mother more than you realize. And now you stand at the same crossroads she once did to live true to your heart, or to live in a way that pleases others." Emily said nothing. She only looked at the necklace in her hands as if seeing herself reflected there, a part fragile, a part strong, and another part uncertain whether she could survive her own choices. Rose poured more tea for them both, her voice low and steady. "This necklace isn't a reward. It's a reminder that there are things power cannot buy, and money cannot protect. But if you can hold on to it, you will never lose your way." When Emily left the estate, the necklace rested around her neck. The turquoise stone lay cool and silent against her skin, like an unspoken promise. She didn't know where the future would lead her, but that night, as the wind tangled through her hair and the city glittered in its unkind light, she understood one thing. Clearly, she was no longer standing on the sidelines. She was part of the story now, and from this moment on, she would have to live as someone who knew it. That night, the Chicago sky held no stars, only a deep, unmoving black that seemed to settle over a city still catching its breath after a long, relentless rain. Emily stepped once more through the iron gates of the Moretti estate. This time there was no hesitation, though peace still felt out of reach. Marco waited on the front steps as always, giving her a brief nod, yet his eyes, once guarded and assessing, now carried something different, an acknowledgement, perhaps, or at least the quiet understanding that she was no longer a stranger. The wooden doors opened, releasing the faint scent of herbs from the kitchen, mingled with the warmth of freshly baked bread, a fragrance so gentle that Emily felt her chest ease without realizing why. Rose stood waiting in the foyer, dressed in a simple silver-gray silk gown, the kind of understated elegance that spoke of both grace and history. She said nothing, only smiled and extended a hand, as though Emily's presence were something she had long expected. Dinner was served in the smaller dining room, the same one Emily had once glimpsed through a doorway when helping Rose home. It was not the grand hall with chandeliers and linen-draped tables, but an intimate space of dark oak, a small fire flickering in the hearth, and black and white photographs lining the walls. One photo made Emily pause, a woman with her hair pinned high, wearing a floral dress from the 50s, her gaze deep and sharp like Rose's, though her face carried a haunting familiarity. Catching Emily's stare, Rose stepped closer, her voice soft as if touching an old memory. "My mother. She was the first to teach me how to stay calm when the world fell into chaos. You remind me of her the way you always try to look composed." They sat down together. No servants, no ceremony. Rose ladled soup into Emily's bowl herself, setting beside it a piece of toasted bread glistening with olive oil and a sprig of thyme. The meal was simple, yet there was a quiet gravity between them that made every gesture feel deliberate. After some light talk about the rose garden and a sparrow that had made its nest in the living room shelf, Rose fell silent for a while, then reached into her pocket and took out a small velvet box. She placed it before Emily, her eyes glowing with an emotion both complex and tender. "This was my mother's," she said, She wore it all her life, and only took it off once the night before I left home to marry. She told me there are things not meant to protect us from the world, but to remind us of who we are within it. Emily opened the box slowly. Inside lay a delicate silver chain. Its pendant, a small turquoise stone, faded by time, yet still glimmering faintly, like a fragment of memory refusing to sleep, for reasons she could not explain. Something inside her loosened a quiet ache blooming beneath her ribs. Rose watched her, her voice like a story, recited from a long-ago night. My mother believed that when a woman loves, she doesn't need to be stronger than anyone else, but she must be steady enough not to lose herself when love stops being simple. I see that in you, not because of anything extraordinary you've done, but because you remain yourself, even as everything around you changes. Emily's fingers tightened around the box before she looked up. I'm afraid, if I keep walking deeper into Nathan's world, I'll lose who I am. Rose smiled, her eyes softening, stripped of their usual steel. Who steps into love without fear? But if you can keep your heart, truly keep it, and I believe you are doing that already, then no one can take from you what you don't allow. Emily said nothing more, only nodded. When the meal ended, they sat together by the fire, speaking little. She touched the pendant lightly, realizing for the first time that she was holding something larger than an heirloom, a piece of history. A lineage of women who had learned how to survive in a world built for powerful men without surrendering their own reflection. As she left, Rose clasped her hand, thin but warm. If ever there comes a time when you're no longer sure who you are, she said, touch that necklace. It won't answer you, but it will remind you that you still belong to yourself, and that will be enough. That night, as Emily sat alone in the back of a taxi, the necklace resting against her skin felt like a second heartbeat, not an ornament, not something meant to be seen, but a quiet part of something enduring and unseen. A reminder, a marker, and the beginning of something truly her own, not bound by debt or gratitude, but by the heart she had finally chosen to keep. The next morning, Emily stood before the mirror for a long time before leaving home. She hadn't changed much in appearance, still the white blouse, the simple black trousers, the neatly tied hair at the back of her neck, but something in her eyes was different. No more confusion, no more fragility. There was a quiet stillness about her now, not the silence of surrender, but the calm of choice. The turquoise pendant rested beneath her collar, cool and light as breath, yet carrying a weight invisible to others. She stepped outside, walking down the same old street where every step once trembled with worry and hesitation. Now each stride felt firm, deliberate, and wholly her own. When Emily entered the Crimson Lounge, the air seemed to pause for a second. The other waitresses turned their heads, a few blinked in surprise. The rest exchanged small, murmured glances as if she had returned from another world. The rumors still lingered. She knew. But this time she didn't bow her head, didn't shrink her shoulders, didn't pretend not to hear. She walked straight to the locker room, changed into her uniform, tied her apron, and secured her hair with a soft green ribbon. When she stepped behind the counter, the manager, Tom, stood there watching her, his expression a mixture of hesitation and uncertainty, as if unsure how to treat her now. But Emily simply smiled and said, in a voice light as air, I'm ready for my shift. The evening passed without incident, but it was far from quiet. Regular customers looked at her more intently. Some whispered to each other, while a few nodded in what seemed like acknowledgement of her return. Michelle, the blonde waitress who had once kept her distance, approached during break and handed Emily a cup of coffee. She didn't say much, just set it beside her and walked away. But the brief glance they exchanged said enough. Something was shifting. At one point, Emily stood before the restroom mirror, washing her hands, and lifted her gaze to her own reflection. She was no longer the girl who had trembled in that dark alley when the steel rod came down. No longer the woman who had cried alone on her kitchen floor, drowning in helplessness. She was Emily with all her scars, her fears, and the courage quietly growing inside her, one choice at a time. By 9 o'clock, the Crimson Lounge was alive with sound. Jazz music floated through the dim amber light as the crowd thickened. Emily stepped from behind the counter to deliver wine to the VIP table as usual, then stopped. The table was empty. In its place sat a bouquet of white roses, resting neatly on the chair, and beneath it, a folded note. She glanced around. No familiar faces. Marco wasn't there. Neither was Nathan. She unfolded the paper. The handwriting was unmistakable. Written in blue ink, "You don't have to fight to be seen. You're already here, and you always will be." She folded the note, tucked it into her pocket, and went back to work. But her steps felt lighter, her spirit not exactly at ease, but clear. She no longer came to work to escape what was happening, but to face it. Not everyone would understand why she chose to stay, but she did, and that was enough. Later that night, after cleaning up and saying goodbye to Tom, Emily stepped out into the street with shoulders no longer weighed down. Chicago at night was still cold, still vast, but it no longer swallowed her whole. She was part of the city now. Even if in some strange way, she had found herself woven into a world most people only whispered about. But Emily was no longer standing on the edge of things. She knew she had just crossed a threshold, quietly, without fanfare, just one small step steady. And hers, near midnight, just as Emily hung her coat on the rack and was about to pour herself a cup of hot tea. The phone rang. Nathan's name appeared on the screen. She hesitated for a heartbeat, not out of doubt, but because something in her gut told her this call was different. His voice came low and rough, like it had traveled a long stretch of road in silence. "Are you asleep?" she answered softly. "Not yet. I just got home." "Is something wrong?" "No," he said after a pause. "I'm just driving around the city. I'm not even sure why. Maybe I just needed a reason to call you." At that, Emily let out a quiet laugh, small, genuine, unguarded. Nathan was silent for several seconds before speaking again. "I'm near Lakeshore Drive. Would you take a drive with me? No bodyguards. No Marco. Just you and me. The car. And the road." Emily looked out the window. The sky was clear tonight. No rain. No wind. Just the steady line of streetlights glittering like a ribbon of fallen stars. She didn't think long. "Give me 10 minutes," she said. The black Bentley waited by the curb, no special plates. No escort. Nathan sat behind the wheel, wearing a long coat and a shirt with the top buttons undone. Tonight he didn't look like a mafia boss. He looked like a man worn down by life, still trying to hold on to a shred of gentleness for one woman. Emily slipped into the passenger seat, fastened her belt, and said nothing as he eased the car into the quiet current of the night. Chicago after midnight was beautiful in its coldness. The skyscrapers stood silent, their windows scattered with only a few faint lights, while Lake Michigan stretched out like a black mirror, reflecting thoughts neither of them dared to speak. For nearly 10 minutes, they said nothing. Only the soft hum of an old jazz tune filled the car, a saxophone sighing like a tired breath. Nathan broke the silence first. "I can't remember the last time I drove alone," he said. "Maybe before my father died. After that, there was always a driver, a schedule, a destination. My life stopped belonging to me." Emily didn't look at him, and tonight she asked quietly, "Whose life is this moment?" Nathan smiled faintly. "Yours, if you want it to be." They stopped along the lakefront, where a wooden bench faced the dark water. Nathan didn't turn off the engine. He just set the brake and leaned slightly toward her. "You have no idea how much you've changed. Emily, the first time I saw you at the farmer's market, you were clumsy, full of life, with nothing to hide. Now, you're cuter, sharper, but lonelier too." Emily turned to him, her tone neither soft nor sharp. "I'm still me. I've just learned that I can't live letting others decide where I go. I don't want to keep being the one who needs saving, and I won't be a shadow in your world." Nathan nodded, his gaze heavy. "I never wanted you to be part of this world, but when you saved my mother, you were already in it, and I don't want you to leave it." No words of love were spoken, yet the silence between them, the rhythm of the waves, the soft light glinting off two faces marked by old wounds was confession enough. Nathan extended his hand, not to touch hers, only to leave it there. A quiet offering, Emily looked at it for a long time. She didn't take it. But she didn't pull away either. "I won't promise to keep you safe forever," he said at last. "My world doesn't allow for that. But if you choose to stay, then every day, I'll choose to stand between you and whatever tries to hurt you." Emily nodded gently. For the first time in weeks, she no longer questioned whether she was on the right path. They said nothing on the drive back. The car moved slowly through the sleeping streets, as if even time itself hesitated to intrude. When Nathan stopped in front of her building, he didn't ask when he would see her again. Emily opened the door, stepped out, and turned back to him. "I don't know where this will take us," she said softly. "But tonight, I don't regret getting in the car." Then she closed the door, walking into the night with a calm heart carrying something fragile and new, born between two people who no longer feared the unknown. The next morning, when Emily walked into the Crimson Lounge, she could feel it immediately. The air in the room had changed. Not the temperature, not the dim lighting she had grown used to, but the looks. They were no longer just curious or doubtful. They carried something heavier, half envy, half mockery, and something close to resentment. A few girls whispered as she passed, their voices low enough to escape accusation but loud enough for her to catch fragments. The boss. Favoritism. High-class whore. Emily didn't stop. She went straight to the counter, checked the reservation book, picked up her serving tray, and stepped into the rhythm of work as if nothing unusual were happening. But inside, she could feel something splintering quietly, like a fever waiting to break. Mid-shift, as she stood in the small break room pouring water, Michelle walked in, shut the door, and leaned against the cabinet, arms folded across her chest. The blonde had always kept her distance, yet she'd been the first to hand Emily a cup of coffee on her first day back. Michelle didn't speak right away. She just watched Emily wiping down the tray with calm precision before giving a faint, unreadable smile. "You're good," she said. "You came back, acting like nothing happened, letting them whisper behind your back and you still hold your head up." Emily looked up, her gaze steady. "If you have something to say, say it. I don't have the energy to guess anymore." Michelle let out a short laugh, not cruel, but knowing, the kind of laugh that comes from someone who's survived too long in a place that eats softness alive. She poured herself a glass of water and sat down across from Emily. "They say you're sleeping with the boss, that you're protected, privileged, intuitive. And you know what? No one really cares whether it's true. They just hate that you're not afraid like they are." Emily sat down beside the table, not bothering to defend herself. "I didn't come here to be treated differently. I came because I need to live. Because of Ben. I never wanted to be anyone's shadow." Michelle nodded, her expression softening. "I know, and I believe you're not the type to climb by lying down. But listen, Emily, in a place like this, you'll have to choose. Either stay silent and let them twist your story, or speak once, clearly, and then move on." Emily was quiet for a long moment. "And if I speak, will anyone believe me?" Michelle shrugged. "Maybe not. But at least you'll know you didn't let someone else write your story for you. And sometimes, one well-timed truth is stronger than 1,000 silences." The shift ended to slow music and fading lights. Emily didn't leave right away. She walked to the center of the room, where a few staff were still cleaning, and the last customers were gathering their coats. She stood straight, her voice calm but clear enough to reach every corner. "If anyone's wondering, I'll say it now. I do know Nathan Moretti, but not the way you think. I'm not his mistress. I once saved his mother's life, and he returned the favor. Yes, he protects me, but I still work like everyone else. I still wipe tables, carry drinks, and listen to your whispers. And I don't need pity. I don't need permission to exist here." The room fell silent. No applause, no insults, just a dense stillness. As if everyone were quietly swallowing her words, Emily turned and walked away without looking back. Her steps felt lighter than they had in weeks. At the door, Michelle was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, eyes glinting with something like respect. "Good job, sweetheart. At least now they can't pretend you don't exist." And that's how change begins. That night, for the first time in weeks, Emily slept deeply without dreams. Not because the world had become any kinder, but because she had finally stopped letting it decide who she was. The next morning, Emily arrived at the Crimson Lounge earlier than usual. The air inside was still heavy with the scent of freshly brewed coffee, and the wooden floor gleamed faintly, still damp from mopping. No one looked up when she walked in, and the sharp, probing stares that once trailed her were gone. But Emily knew the silence didn't mean they had forgotten. It meant they could no longer judge her so easily. She didn't need anyone's approval, only that no one dared to dismiss her again. Today, she wasn't here just to work. She was here to claim her place, quietly but unmistakably. When the morning shift began, Tom, the floor manager, made his rounds, assigning tables as usual. Each server got their section, except for the VIP area near the stage, which remained unassigned. That section had always been off-limits for Emily. Nathan often sat there, and no one wanted to take the risk of offending the wrong person. But this time, when Tom paused over his clipboard, hesitating, Emily stepped forward and spoke in an even tone. "I'll take the VIP section today." Tom blinked, surprised, as if unsure he'd heard her right. "You sure?" he asked. She nodded, calm and steady. "If people think I'm being favored, I'd rather prove I can handle the responsibility everyone else avoids." The mood in the room shifted immediately. A few girls exchanged glances. Some raised their brows, but no one objected. Tom gave a small nod and marked her name on the sheet. "All right. It's yours. Do it well." Throughout the shift, Emily handled the VIP tables without a single mistake. Nathan didn't show up, but the guests who sat there, men and women with money, influence, and sharp eyes, watched her closely. Some asked casually about the boss. Others tried to bait her with half-veiled remarks. Emily answered every question with poise and a professionalism so polished that even the boldest inquiries faded into silence. When the shift ended and the staff gathered in the break room, Michelle handed her a bottle of water. There was a hint of amusement in her expression, but also something like respect. "You know," she said, "I think they were waiting for you to slip. But you didn't. You made them look at themselves instead." Emily smiled faintly, wiping the sweat from her forehead. "I don't need them to like me, Michelle. I just want them to think twice before talking behind my back." Michelle nodded once, turned, and left her alone in the quiet room, where the ceiling fan turned lazily above her. A few minutes later, Tom came in holding a small stack of invoices and the shift ledger. He placed a plain envelope in front of her. "No name. No mark. This just came in. It's for you." Emily opened it. Inside was a small piece of paper, written in dark brown ink, a small move, but a smart one. "I see you. Don't stop. Nathan." She folded the note and tucked it into her pocket, saying nothing, but her eyes gleamed with something sharp and a live determination. She didn't know how Nathan had seen it, but she knew he was watching, not to interfere, but to witness her becoming who she was meant to be. That evening, as she left the Crimson Lounge, the city lights shimmered across the streets, and a cool wind wound its way through every corner. Emily walked slowly, unhurried, unafraid. She knew that every look, every whisper, was no longer a burden. They were proof of her presence, a woman once seen as an outsider now standing in the center, shaping her own orbit. And it wasn't because of a powerful man. It was because she chose not to bow, because of one small step taken at exactly the right time. The sky had begun to darken with rain when Emily stood before the tall iron gates of the Moretti estate. She hadn't brought an umbrella, nor had she called ahead. But after receiving the handwritten note Nathan had sent, she knew it was time, not to thank him, not to confess what had been left unsaid, but to face him, to ask the questions that had lived too long in silence. Marco opened the door. He looked at her surprised for a brief second and stepped aside without a word. She walked in on her own, the sound of her wet shoes tapping lightly against the dark wooden floor. Nathan was in the library, where the soft light from a desk lamp spilled over rows of books. He wasn't in a suit tonight, only a white shirt under a black sweater. His posture calm, but his eyes shifting like a still lake stirred by wind. You came, he said. Emily stopped a few steps away, still holding the light coat she hadn't yet taken off. I read your note, she said. Thank you for seeing me. But I didn't come here for praise. I came because there are things you've never really said. Nathan nodded slightly, set the book down, and turned fully toward her. Go on, he said quietly. She took a slow breath, her gaze steady now. I don't know what I am in your life. A debt, a memory, a woman you care for, or just a way for you to make peace with your past. But I can't keep moving forward if I'm only living inside gratitude and protection. I need to know, am I a choice? Or just a reaction? Silence filled the room, stretching across a few heartbeats. The ticking of the clock on the wall sounded unnervingly loud. When Nathan finally spoke, his voice was low but without defense. I'm not easy to love, Emily. I'm not easy to trust. After everything I've seen and lost, I've learned to keep the world at arm's length. But you walked in without asking, without trying, and suddenly, I wasn't who I used to be. Not because I owed you anything, but because, for the first time, I wanted someone to stay. Not to save me, but because I couldn't bear to watch her disappear. Emily smiled faintly, though her eyes shimmered with tears. I don't need you to say you love me. I just need you to stop putting me behind every decision you make. If you want me beside you, then let me walk with you, not follow you. I'm not a piece on your chessboard, no matter how special you think it is. Nathan stepped closer, not urgently, not possessively. He stopped within one step's reach, but he didn't touch her. You're not a piece, he said softly. You're the reason I'd walk away from the game altogether. If you stay, I can't promise it'll be safe, but I promise nothing in my life will happen again without your voice in it. Emily looked at him for a long moment. Her heart was racing, but not from fear. For the first time, they were truly standing before each other, no masks, no depths, no ghosts between them, just two people, trying to find a way forward, not because they had to, but because they had chosen to. She slipped off her coat, laid it on the chair, and took a step closer. If I stay, she said, her voice steady, it's because I choose to, not because anyone owes anyone, not because of the past, but because I choose you. And I won't make that choice again if you go back to the way things were, where every decision was made without asking me. Nathan nodded once. No more words were needed. He extended his hand, not to take, not to claim, but to offer. Emily placed hers in his. Light yet sure. It wasn't a grasp of possession. It was a vow. Two people, two worlds. One decision. Outside. The rain began to fall harder, but inside that room, surrounded by books and the ghosts of memory, there was nothing left to hide. Only truth and the uncertain road ahead, slowly coming into view in the way they now looked at each other. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the Moretti estate, casting soft golden stripes across the polished wooden floor. Emily woke not in fear, nor in uncertainty as she had so many mornings before. She sat up, drew back the curtain, and gazed out at the garden, where early mist still hovered over the white roses. A calmness settled deep within her, as if, at last, she had stopped running from herself. Beneath the armor of strength and all the time she had forced herself not to break, she was simply a woman yearning to be seen, to be chosen, to live a life defined by her own choice. Nathan entered the kitchen, 2 steaming cups of coffee in hand. He handed one to her without a word. Between them, words were no longer necessary. A glance was enough to understand her presence here was no longer in question. It was truth, when he quietly said, "You belong here." It wasn't a command, nor an arrangement. It was an acknowledgement that after all the storms, the rumors, the fear, the choices and the trials, Emily had proven she wasn't someone who came and went like the wind. She stayed, not because she needed saving, but because she had found a place where her heart finally felt whole. Belonging, she realized, isn't something granted by others. It's something we know within ourselves when we finally see where we stand and why. This story, more than anything, is a reminder in life. Some people arrive as unexpected turns, And somehow, through them, we discover a part of ourselves we were too afraid to face. All of us, at one point or another, have felt lost in places that should have felt familiar. We've hidden our pain to survive in a world that judges too easily. We've doubted our worth when seen through the lens of others. But like Emily, we can choose not to live forever in the shadow of gratitude. We can stand tall, move forward, and love with the most honest parts of who we are. If you've stayed with us until this moment, thank you for listening to Emily and Nathan's journey. How did their story make you feel? Did any part of it mirror something in your own life? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Because every story, at its heart, is more than just an event. It's a bridge from one heart to another. Don't forget to subscribe and share this video if you believe it's a story worth hearing. Underworld Love Stories will continue bringing you moving, deeply human tales, each one a new journey, a new reflection. To you who are watching now, we wish you good health, peaceful days, and a heart that always feels at ease. Thank you, and we'll see you in the next story.